Sorry, for me, okay.
Ready?
What is this white people coming in willingly to America as slave people?
Right. Basically, that starts in like the early 1600s. Right? Well, even before then, because so you have with the American colonies being settled, the first groups of people that came over were actually convicts, right? So from Europe. So people who would have otherwise been like sentenced to death are being shipped to the American colonies to avoid having to like be killed because of their death sentence, right? That's your like first wave of people coming over. You have like criminals coming over, people who are accused of certain crimes, heresy, and things like that. They're being put on these boats to come to America to basically live out their days on the American colonies, right? So then the second wave of migration that you have is you have the indentured servitude, right? So the American colonies are being settled and they need people to come work. They need people to come work the land. So the passage to America being so expensive, they have these quote unquote generous people, these benefactors agreeing to pay for people's passage to America. The part that we don't really talk about that's like not well discussed in terms of American history is the number of people who were on those boats that didn't want to come to America, right? Like you have famine and so much poverty happening mostly in England that we never really hear the stories about the women who were basically sold. And now they're also on these boats coming over to come to the American colonies. So you see the ending, I believe, of indentured servitude. It starts to kind of like phase out within like the 1700s because there's an increase in African slave labor. But with the indentured servitude, right, we don't call these people slaves. We don't refer to them as white slaves because they're in contract, right? So they're not property. They work a term of like, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, right? In America, and then in exchange, they get land, right? That's supposed to be what happens. They get on the boat. They can't afford to get on the boat. Someone pays for them. They come here to work for free and for like a period of time, like, 4 to 7 years. After that time, okay, they have their own land. That's if they live that long, right? But then you also have in those, and I have some like resources to share with you. You have in those indentured contracts, these like clauses about like morality, right? So you can't fornicate, you can't get married, you can't like go out and socialize for the term period that you're working for this white master, right? And if you're found to be doing any of those things, your 7-year contract can be extended. And now you have to work more years for this person because you didn't, follow their rules of their household or whatever, right? You also have apprenticeships, right? So these are young people, these are children, these are teenagers, young adults that are being paired with a master, right? That is supposed to teach them a certain trade, blacksmithing, cobbling, whatever it be, right? They're supposed to learn this trade from this master. They also have these same type of clauses in their contract where they can't get married and they can't fornicate and all of these things until the contract is up. And a lot of those cases with that and the indentured servitude, you have people being, abused physically, sexually, violent cases of abuse and things like that. And then as far as like going back to the indentured servants, they were largely domestic workers. So you have them being hired to like cook and clean in people's houses. You have them being hired to be nannies, to be maids. But then you also, on the part of the men, you have a lot of field workers. So that's where you get to, at least in the early part of American history, where you have like white and black people working on the plantation together.
Okay, we in Spanish have a problem because we don't have a word for this to describe slavery. What changed in this is intent servitude is not the cattle slavery that we black suffer. That's different condition.
Right.
But white people were never subject to this kind of slavery, right? Or I am okay.
Yeah. So I don't know what the equivalent would be in Spanish, because I know like Spanish is like for slavery it's like esclavos, right? But I don't know. I guess maybe whatever the word would be for servants, because I haven't done too much research on like the Caribbean, but this was also happening in the Caribbean, where so when I say white people are getting on boats and like making contracts to come to get passage to the Americas, I mean like literally the Americas, right? So North America, to the New World. So you have indentured servants in the Caribbean as well that go there as well. I know it was very popular on the sugar canes, at least in like Jamaica and stuff like that. So it could be possible that some of these people also went to other places in the Caribbean as well.
No,
So
we have that case in intended servitude, like in Cuba, we have the Chinese people came on the contract, and the conditions were that. But whenever I try to translate the concept of slavery, they use translate as a slavery. They don't make the difference, and the difference is very important. The difference is very important.
Yes, because they don't have the it's not the same restrictions that like black slaves had, right? So like the fact that like black people were considered property. Oh, this is another point that I wanted to bring up to you too, is that at least in the North American colonies, right? And we're talking about North America, which would later become the United States, is that you have when you have all of these indentured servants and apprentices coming over, right, and getting into these contracts. This is another thing. Those people that are entering the contracts, a lot of them can't read, a lot of them can't write, so they don't even know what they're signing, right? They're just marking X's, and it is what it is. It's a legal document now, right? So they don't even know what's going on. They just know they coming to America.
Yeah, at the end they're a slave. Just the condition is not the same, but they don't even know. So they're the same.
Yeah.
Okay, that's okay. You have country.
Yeah, so it's by no means is it like a legal equivalent, right? Like I know I saw some articles like maybe a couple of years ago where they were basically trying to say that like the Irish people that were in America, that they were like slaves too. No, that's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that these people that came over with these contracts are working very closely in close proximity with black slaves on plantations, right? Because there's so many jobs that need to be done. And I think that at least in our own history, like in America, the way that they teach us in school, we get it very black and white, right? It's like white people had slaves, black people were slaves, right? But we never talk about the poor white people who didn't own slaves and didn't own land, and they still had to make a living as well, right? So you see, and then, so after slavery, you see an upkick in apprenticeship again, but now you see the formerly enslaved children becoming apprentices, right? So a lot of them were orphans from, like, they would have lost their parents in the Civil War and stuff like that. A lot of them become wards of the state, they become orphans, and then they're in apprenticeships where now they have to work for free as well, right? In learning these different trades. But you still have these white people as well. So you get to a certain point in like the early 1900s of American history where you have labor camps, right? And this is where we see a lot of Irish people and working right alongside black people in the labor camps again. So it's always this interconnectedness between our groups of people, which is evident like in our DNA, right? Because you have to, at some point, you have to kind of ask yourself a question, like when it comes to black people in America, if white people hated us so much, why do so much of us have like such a big chunk of like European ancestry, right? Like it just doesn't add up, right? If you have this small group of people owning slaves, right? Like you have like the Whitney plantation and things like that in Louisiana, where this one man owns 250,000 slaves. Like, is it really possible that all of the descendants that have mixed ancestry came from that slave owner? No, it's not. You know, there's a lot of intermixing and mingling that's happening between our cultures that we don't talk about. And we also, I know, I think you're familiar, of course, with W.E.B. Du Bois. When he wrote Black Reconstruction, he talks about this in his book, right? He talks about the white, like the white labor force, the poor white labor force. And basically there's also, at least on the dynamic of the plantations, where you see the wealth gap kind of like widening, right? So you have Black people who are slaves, they're poor. You have poor white people who don't own land and don't own slaves working for these white people right alongside these Black people, right? So when they start to see that it's not going to be possible for them to get land as well, because a lot of those indentured servitude contracts are being defaulted on, right? Like, oh, you went to a bar, oh, you have a girlfriend, so we're going to extend your time out. And a lot of these people are not getting what they were promised at the end of their 4 to 7 years. So you see them and Black people start to work together like against the white slave owners, right? So it becomes not so much a race issue as it is a class issue of like the haves versus the have-nots. And when the white planters see this have versus have-not dynamic happening, this is when you start to see more legal distinctions between Black people and white people. So then now the poor white people that are over here with the Black people, because we're poor together, right? So you have plantations over here, you have poor people over here. Now the white poor people are being pulled over here under the guise of white supremacy, right? So they're starting to get more laws and more benefits and things like that socially.
At what moment that start happening? At what moment?
So you see this still when slavery is happening, right? You start to see like in the late, I want to say like it's definitely before the 1850s, right? But you start to see certain laws being in place, like miscegenation laws and stuff like that, that forbid Black people and white people from intermarrying with each other, right? And you start to get even the Black codes in different places where the condition of the slave, this is where it becomes that the condition of the slave follows the condition of the mother, right? Because you see a lot of interracial relationships happening. So now you know that if a white man has a baby with a Black woman, that baby is still going to be a slave, right? It's not always the white man impregnating the Black woman isn't always the slave owner. You know, a lot of times it's those people that are also working on the plantation that are not Black. So they start to pass these laws and things and create these kind of social distinctions between, you know, Black people and white people, so that white people now are kind of solidifying together under the guise of white supremacy. And then it's no longer being about like, oh, I'm rich and you're poor. It's we're all white.
What do you know about the Gulagic culture and the spread of Black culture in the rest of America?
So Gullah Geechee, I don't know anything specifically about Gullah Geechee because that's not specifically where my people come from, right? On my mom's side, my family is from Texas, and before Texas, they were in Louisiana. On my dad's side, my family is from Louisiana. But I can tell you this, is that the term Geechee, right, is used among people in the South. It's a derogatory term. We use it for somebody that wasn't like socially acceptable, or for somebody that did, delve into alternative magical practices. Even if it wasn't necessarily hoodoo, they would call it Geechee.
What do you know about the hoodoo?
So I know, Gullah Geechee they have their own specific like type of hoodoo, right? Hoodoo is very regional. It depends on where you go. I personally I separate hoodoo from conjure, group work, and ancestral veneration. To me, hoodoo is it's like the culture, right? It's the folklore, it's the tradition, it's the stories. But it is Black people who came over as slaves, a lot of them being from the Congo and settling in parts of the Deep South, mixing magic with the Native Americans, right? Like when the Africans came over here, we got a lot of we had our own plant medicine, but when you get here, the herbs are different, the plants are different, right? So they're being taught by the Native people what these plants are. I've seen a lot of like in my own research from like my spiritual family and just like, you know, the research that I do, that like a lot of people in the kind of, again, this is now going back to like the Carolinas area, but like the Great Dismal Swamp, right, that covers Virginia and the Carolinas, Native people living in the swamp. And then Black people start to move into the swamp and they exchange ideas there as far as like plant medicine and magic. But to me, hoodoo is the amalgamation of different African practices, primarily Congo, coming in with Native American and some people don't like to talk about this, but it's very true. Even some of the indigenous practices of white people, their European magic as well. We like to always say like the white part of it is the Bible, but that's not really true. That's like a later wave of hoodoo where the Bible gets introduced.
It's later. The Bible is true, but later, no from the beginning.
Yeah, not from my understanding. No, that is not. It's not right there from the beginning. No, like when America starts to get settled, only like 15% of the people that were in the colonies, like 15% of the white people were Christian. So the Bible becomes a later wave because you start to see, basically because of the laws and our practices being outlawed and stuff like that, you start to see a lot of synchronization, right? Like the same thing that you see in like Haitian Vodou between the Loa and the Saints, and you see it also in like Kumi with the Orisha. You know, the hoodoo practitioners start to hide a lot of what they're doing under the guise of like meeting for church.
Okay. That makes sense. So the beginning of the Black Church is very ambiguous.
Yes. Yeah. So you have like, they used to call them shout circles and things of that nature, right? Where the enslaved Africans would kind of meet, and they would get together on Sundays, and they would do their little ring shouting and things like this. You see this very much in the church that I grew up in is called Kojic, Church of God in Christ. The founder of the Church in God in Christ, his mother, she was born enslaved, and she was a conjure woman. She was a healer. Today we would call her a root worker, but she would put different medicines together to heal people, right? And then he had his own set of gifts. He, like in the hoodoo tradition, we would have called him a seer, right? But like in church, we call him a prophet. And he's the founder of now what is like the largest Black church organization. Now, today, the Kojic Church is in like 60 different countries. But it's founded by this man whose mother was like a root worker, you know, like she did what we would call quote unquote slave magic. But a lot of traditions that you see among hoodoos, I grew up doing that in church, and I didn't know that it was hoodoo because that's not what we call it, right? There's his name was Bishop C.H. Mason, Charles Henry Mason. And he actually had, if you like look him up, you'll see this very famous picture of him kind of posing with all of these different like roots and tree branches.